Acrylic gouache has an acrylic resin binder or polymer binder, which is similar to regular acrylics. This means that it dries to a permanent layer, and that differs from traditional gouache, which uses a gum arabic binder, which can be reactivated after it dries. And acrylic gouache dries with a velvety smooth matte finish, just like traditional gouache. So whether you call it acrylic gouache or matte acrylics doesn't really matter. In this video, I'll share some thoughts about using acrylic gouache. And yeah, that paragraph was a mouthful. I've used both regular acrylics and traditional gouache for years, and my insights are coming from a landscape painter's perspective whose normal style requires layering opaque color, so keep that in mind. The brand I'm using here is Holbein Acryla Gouache. I've reviewed Holbein Artist Gouache before, and I loved them, so I had really high hopes for this paint. And actually, I've used this sparingly in the past, mostly as an underpainting, and I do have a video about that, but I never took the time to properly understand it and use it on its own much. This time I bought a limited selection of colors because I prefer to work with a limited palette at all times. I found it curious that they offer a color called Super Opaque White, so of course I had to buy that and compare it to traditional titanium white. And to be honest, I didn't really notice much of a difference. But, I always go through my white tubes really fast, so I'm happy to have extra anyway. I did buy a couple of convenience colors, especially these nice pastel tones, because I just love them and I use them in my skies and distant landscape elements now and then. The first thing I do when I buy new paint is to do some color swatches, just to discover what they look like on their own, and I mix them with white because that's required in most paintings. While doing these swatches, I noticed the paint dries out pretty quickly on the palette, especially as you thin it down and spread it out. The thicker piles of paint will stay wet for longer, and you can use them maybe like about 30 minutes, depending how thick they are, but the mixtures dried out pretty fast, under 5 minutes. To encourage the paint to glide easily, I recommend mixing it on a slick surface like glass or ceramic. If you use a wooden or plastic palette, depending how porous it is, the paint might stick more than you want it to, and it might be really tricky to clean off completely. The other thing I do when I buy new paint is to do some Lightfast tests. Most pigments will show more signs of fading when diluted, especially with white. So I start with a pure swatch of color, then increase the amount of white until I have a few tints. Then I'll hang that in the window for 4 to 6 months, and I'll keep my gouache database updated for you all, and the link for that is in the description. I have Lightfast tests for all of my other gouache brands. Then I do some color mixing, which is so much fun. This is where I get to discover what variety of mixes I can create and how much I can stretch these colors out. This can easily take up an entire afternoon, if not more, and several pages in my sketchbook, but I find it useful to refer back to these pages when I'm outside painting and trying to find the perfect color. This is also a stress-free way to get used to how the paint behaves. Acrylic gouache feels heavier and a little stickier than regular gouache to me. When adding water, it can quickly go from perfect to kind of awful depending on the mixture. In addition, as the paint dries, it solidifies, so adding water when it's more dry will result in a goopy, chunky mess. That's why it's especially important to mix on an easily cleanable surface, and not to store the paint in any palettes you particularly love, because you might not be able to remove it. The goal of my first test painting is to get a feel for the paint in its most natural form, so I try to use it straight from the tube and avoid diluting it as much as possible. This really gives me an idea of the binder attributes. Adding too much water can break down the binder and lead to undesirable effects, which for me would be unwanted transparency. A weak binder may also reduce permanent adhesion, so when I first test a paint, I like to see how viable it is to paint without any other added mediums. Maybe that's just a weird me thing. However, this is really tricky with acrylics, as they tend to need some help to flow, either water or mediums. And since acrylic gouache is made to be diluted with water, it stands to reason that watercolor mediums can be used. And since I already owned my watercolor blending medium that I use with traditional gouache, I decided to compare that versus using water. Acrylic mediums could probably be used as well. However, some of those might result in the paint losing its velvety matte finish, therefore kind of defeating the purpose in my opinion. It's like, in that case, why not just use regular acrylics, which are much cheaper? Anyways, the watercolor blending medium definitely seemed to help with the flow, and it kept the paint a little bit more opaque than when I diluted it with water. So I ended up using this during my painting process. I'm still experimenting with how much of this to use, but for the first painting, my strategy was to just dip the corner of the brush into the medium before picking up the color, and then mixing it on the palette. As I was painting, I constantly found myself not mixing enough color. I'd mix a small amount like I would with traditional gouache, but within a couple of brush strokes, it would be used up. And since I was trying to keep the opacity and not dilute the mixes, I just kept running out. And the other thing I noticed is that when the mixes get a little bit thinner, it feels a little bit stickier. They kind of dry out a bit, obviously, and that creates a lot of brush drag. But I actually ended up loving what effect this made on the paper. It helped me create lots of dry brush layers really easily, and I think that's what led to the more painterly quality of the finished piece. And obviously this is something that would take a lot of getting used to, and at times could be really frustrating. But if you embrace that sticky brush drag, and if you enjoy layering lots of dry brush textures, this can be kind of fun after a while. If you need it to be very opaque, you can add the blending medium or experiment with other mediums, or just use way more paint. After this first test painting, I decided to do another scene and compare it on white versus toned paper. It does change a little bit how you use the paint depending on what paper you're using. With white paper, you don't have to use quite as much paint, and you actually can dilute it and let it be slightly transparent, but because the white paper is underneath, it still looks pretty bright and saturated. On beige paper like this, you really have to use opaque paint, otherwise that color shows through and it will really affect your colors in the end. For those of you interested in painting along with me, I did do a full tutorial over on my Patreon page of this painting on the white paper, since I know more people use white paper. In that tutorial, I share some insights and more of a step-by-step process for how to paint this particular scene, which is a great way to get to know acrylic gouache if you haven't tried it yet. I'm going to let you watch the process for a minute, and then I'm going to talk about how to clean up and dispose of the paint, and then share some final thoughts towards the end.
The world from the place beneath the willow, the willow. So many years, too many tears on your pillow, on your pillow.
Clean up, as tempting as it is, I do not recommend washing acrylic gouache or any acrylics down the sink. The more paint that goes down the drain, the more it can solidify and clog up and block the drain completely. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. Don't tell my husband. Instead, it's recommended to do a wash, evaporate, scrape method, and this is something I've been doing with my acrylics for years. I keep a couple buckets in the shed, and when it's time to dispose of my paint water, I pour the dirty water in, and by the next day, the pigments have settled to the bottom, the clean water remains at the top, so I can actually reuse this clean water, and then the rest I let evaporate or scrape out of the bottom of the bucket, or you can just let it sit there indefinitely, it kind of doesn't matter. Once you scrape out the accumulated solids at the bottom of the bucket, you can just let that dry and throw it away. And most recycling or disposal centers have rules for how to dispose of paints, so you can check out their websites for more localized rules. So with all of this extra stuff to consider about using acrylic gouache, what is the point? Is it worth it? I mean, I'd say the most relevant reason that you would want to use acrylic gouache is that you want the painting surface to be permanent when you're finished. I think it's also useful during the painting process because I think a lot of people struggle with layering gouache without creating a muddy mess, because traditional gouache can be reactivated with just a tiny bit of water. As you layer it, you can end up reactivating the layers below, and it's really difficult to get a solid color on top of another color, or just without creating a gray or muddy mixture. So with acrylic gouache, you can paint each layer and let them dry without worrying about reactivating it later. I actually found that pretty useful in my skies in particular, because you don't want to create too much of a heavy, muddy mess in the sky. So letting it dry completely before moving on to a darker or lighter layer was pretty useful. Since I'm used to blending into my layers indefinitely with traditional gouache, this did take some getting used to. You kind of have to think ahead a little bit, but I can definitely see that strategy being useful for many people. So there you have it. There are my thoughts about acrylic gouache. If you thought this was useful, please give me a thumbs up so that YouTube knows I did a good job, and it will share with other people interested in acrylic gouache. And by the way, pretty much as soon as I finished these paintings, I ended up ordering some other brands of acrylic gouache. So I do have some Liquitex and some Turner acrylic gouache headed my way, and I plan on doing a comparison review between the three, and mostly focusing on how they feel to paint with, because there are already plenty of swatching videos out there to help you choose what colors to get. I'm more interested in how the paint actually feels when you use it in a painting situation. So if you're interested in that, make sure you subscribe before you go. All right, everyone, happy painting. I'll see you next time. Take care.